more slowly at a time credit growth needs to be restrained. What are the implications on policies?
Well, China is at a bit of a crossroads right now in terms of policy. Clearly, the new administration under Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang are interested in trying to tame some of the excesses in terms of credit growth that had driven Chinese growth since the outbreak of the global financial crisis in 2008, and especially with that big credit push in 2009. So we're looking at a tighter environment now that was certainly illustrated by the deliberate move to increase the tightness of interbank liquidity last month. And I think as we look out over the next 6 months and into early 2014, our assumption would be that Chinese growth is going to remain under a relatively heavy policy restraint. We should be looking for downside risks to growth. And as a result, it's very likely that the next move, perhaps 6 months down the road, may be one to actually reduce the reserve requirement ratio. That wouldn't necessarily be an easing, however. It would be a means of managing domestic liquidity as China faces increasingly its own brand of capital outflows rather than inflows.
What is your recommendations for Chinese assets?
Well, the big question for equity investment in China is really how much of this is already priced in. And when we look at the current outlook for both revenue growth out into early next year, as well as the consensus forecast for Chinese earnings growth, we think that at this point there's actually quite a bit of downside risk already priced. To give an example, China's price-to-book multiple is about 1.3 times, and that would suggest by regional standards that markets are expecting China can only grow its ROE by about 9% per year, maybe 10%, whereas China in reality has been producing about 15% ROE over the past 12 months. So markets, in other words, are already positioned for a substantial slowdown. That should eventually make China a buy on fact, since it clearly has already been a sell on expectation.
Japan's Nikkei 225 index has risen 40% since the start of the year. Is there much more to go in this rally? And if so, what would be the key drivers with the upper house elections due on Sunday?
We do think that Japan still has quite a bit further to run here. In fact, as I look out over the second half of 2013, I would argue that Japan is still the most interesting Asia-Pacific equity market in terms of upside prospects. It's very important to remember that even with the substantial outperformance of the first half of the year, Japanese stocks are actually still relatively inexpensive. Rather than the rally of the first half of 2013 taking Japanese equities into richly overvalued territory, what it's really done is simply to reduce a state of deep undervaluation that reflected the extremely tight and inappropriate policy settings of 2012. Now that Japan is in the process of unwinding that excessive tightness in monetary policy, and with the prospect, particularly after the July 21 upper house elections, that the Abe government could pursue more pro-growth structural reform, we think that the Japanese equity markets still have substantial further upside. We're looking for 18,000 on the Nikkei by the end of this year, potentially.